Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Kuju from Reading Under the Olive Tree, and here I am with my first video on my page, and I am quite excited about it. What encouraged me to post this video instead of writing a reflection was my good friend Joanna Eleftheriou's memoir, This Way Back. Joanna and I actually met in Missouri, out of all places. We both went to the University of Missouri. We both got our PhDs at the University of Missouri, and I met Joanna when I first started my studies. She had already graduated at the time, and she was working in Texas, but she visited Columbia, Missouri, and so I got the opportunity to get to know her there. And her memoir, This Way Back, was published last year in October, and it's been on my list since before it was published, really, because Joanna and I had conversations about her book before it came out. But with dissertation writing and with my defense and the pandemic and the move back to Turkey, I just didn't get the chance. So I was elated when I finally was able to buy a copy of it on Amazon and read the book. And it really was like having a conversation with Joanna. Very insightful. I am honored. I'm honored to have this conversation with Joanna about her book, about what she's been up to, about being a writer. So let me introduce Joanna to you a little bit before we begin our conversation. Dr. Joanna Eleftheriou is an assistant professor of English at Christopher Newport University, and she is also a contributing editor of Essay, a journal of nonfiction studies, and a faculty member at the writing workshops in Greece. Her essays, short stories, and translations appear regularly in various journals, including but not limited to Arts and Letters and The Common. Based in Hampton Roads, Virginia, Joanna regularly spends time in New York, Cyprus, and Greece. This Way Back is one of my favorite collection of essays. In a series of wonderful pieces, Joanna Eleftheriou in This Way Back explores what it means to have a multifaceted identity and a hyphenated spirit in a polarized world, what it means to straddle multiple worlds and multiple cultures. It moves beyond binary opposites, offering a refreshing way to think about displacement, immigration, family, faith, identity, gender, and national belonging. I enjoyed Joanna's insight into Greekness, what it means to be a Greek, into Americanness. And as a Turk, especially, I appreciated her comments, her essays on the Cyprus-Turkish conflict, because it is almost impossible to find any literary representations or any works that explore this tension. And I cannot wait for our conversation any longer. So grab your cup of coffee, grab your cup of tea, and join us. Your book explores like such a broad range of fascinating themes like identity, faith, religion, gender, and then of course, I was specifically interested in your take on the Turkish Cyprus conflict, Greco-Turkish conflict. So I thought a lot about that particular essay when you cross over to the other side with your British
That's
friend.
the other side, and it's the earliest essay in the book, which is the one thing that is not evident, and I didn't put in like the chronology. So it's the oldest essay.
Oh, it's the oldest one. Okay.
In 2005. I was 26 years old when I wrote it.
To me, it seemed like the narratives, the Palestinian narratives that I read, and I had no idea. I did not know, because where can I really
Yeah.
about, a Cypriot's experiences crossing
Right.
over to North Cyprus, to the other side. And, one thing that was really interesting was when you and your friend, you cross over and then you see Ne Mutlu Türk'üm diyene, this huge sign. I
How
have
happy I am to be a Turk.
Yes, yes, how happy I am to be a Turk. And so I'm reading it, and then you guys are laughing, right? The narrator and the character. I felt not offended. It's not,
Yeah.
no, it's definitely not, it's not offended. Not offended, but I kind of felt like, well, so what? Like, well, so what? And then I was fascinated by how ingrained it is that how happy I am to be a Turk, because I recited it over and over again in school. And I am the least nationalistic person that you know, but I was like a little like, it was fascinating.
Wow.
It was fascinating to me that I had that. I mean, just because I was very alert as I was reading it, like, okay, how am I going to respond, right, to a Cypriot's, Southern Cypriot's reaction as they cross over and visit Northern Cyprus. So I was very alert. And I think that's why I was able to catch that reaction.
Catch. I was thinking of the same
Yeah,
word.
catch.
And I've talked about how I try in this book to examine the effects of Greek exceptionalism and Greek nationalism on me. And one of the reasons I have the scenes where we grow up actually acting out the revolution and tall boys with the sword, and that's the Turk, and you're the little people,
Yep.
little victims. And so I show the reader, okay, this is how I grew up. So I'm going to have the effects of that nationalism in me, and we can't get rid of them. And that's what's so exciting to be able to have this conversation. If we were some kind of like caricatures of liberal woke people, we might assert that we had entirely divested from our nationalism and we had none of those remnants, but that you can accept that I laughed at that sign because there's so much in there in that laugh, right? And that I think I have to take responsibility for, that I'm looking down on a culture I was told to think is inferior. So part of that laugh, like I was told to think of that your culture as inferior. And it's hard to say even. I was taught to think of your culture as inferior.
Of course.
And I'm like suddenly ashamed of that. And so that you have pride in that caused me in my sense of superiority to laugh. Plus, of course, it's a bad translation. I mean, that's the real reason for the laughter. It's terrible translation. I'm sure it sounds much more elegant. And it's hard to say Turkish.
What
And I
you're doing
wonder
here
if you
is
could come up with
invaluable.
Thanks.
But my question was, because you also explore your family history, and your family's history is replete with displacements and terrible experiences, right, in Turkey as well. So, what I was thinking the whole time, how did you really come to that realization? A section where you actually ask, you say, I think it was in the same essay. Let me see here. You say, no one seems to worry about this question though, when they're discussing the Turkish Cyprus conflict. If
Of
we go back, yes,
where are the Turks gonna go?
where will the Turks go? And this is such a shift in the discourse, I think, because you are looking at it through a humanistic perspective. As someone who grew up with all these nationalistic propaganda and narratives, so I was really curious, how did you come to that?
That's a great question, because it's a great question because it's one I didn't really ask myself, because it happened to me, and unless you're asked, you don't think about it. So I'm wondering, okay, how did that happen? One explanation that's really interesting, I think I've mentioned how I felt like when I went to university at Cornell, people thought I was strange because I cared about politics. They couldn't understand. I started writing about the Greek and Turkish conflict from undergrad. In undergrad, I wrote an essay called Green Lines Between Us. It's a really kind of corny title, but I was writing about the Green Line from undergrad, because I felt like my consciousness was really marked by the invasion, even though I hadn't lived through it and none of my family had been affected by it, because of what I think is cultural trauma, right? And it was this huge collective trauma that just has a lot of ripple effects throughout Greek Cypriot culture. And so when I went there as a teenager in middle school, I just felt constantly flooded on every side. It was the problem of the invasion. As I mentioned, I chose the title of my book in part because it's based on an error that I made, assuming that a road sign had the context of the invasion and displacement of the refugees. I think also what we were just talking about with the displacement of people and this looking for a home caused me to really latch onto the problem of the refugees within their own country is what the people that fled invading forces from the northern Cyprus to southern Cyprus. So this idea that you could become displaced and still be in your country is like really matches my sense of displacement and exile. So I was kind of obsessed with this problem, really wanted to write about it. And then I got asked a lot, why are you obsessed? So because I wasn't supposed to be obsessed, because it wasn't affecting me as an individual in a material way. So I guess all that made me want to write about it. And the more I wrote about it and got largely lack of understanding, pushback from American readers, the more I was able to examine the way all of those ideologies and cultural markers and symbols in my imagination were totally illegible and foreign to my American readers. And because I'm also American, I guess I feel a compulsion to explain my like Greek Cypriot self to my American self. And like, I feel this compulsion to demand that my American colleagues understand this experience. And then the added plus, I think, is that I hope that my reflections on Greek nationalism and Turkish nationalism, the way they conflict, will help American readers see themselves kind of in the mirror of Greek exceptionalism. I hope that Greek nationalism, Greek exceptionalism, Turkish nationalism will reflect back Americans' own exceptionalism so they can get a little uncomfortable with their own assumptions about America's greatness.
But how did your family react to, quote unquote, your obsession with the history?
My father loved it. As I say in the first essay, he says that Joanna is a Greek, Dino is an American.
Yes. What about your perspective on the relationship between Turkey and Greece? Did he know your perspective, or did he know that
my skepticism? Probably not.
Questioning. Okay.
Oh, and there's this moment so he didn't live to read many of my essays. Some of them I published in journals and I hid from him. Like, I didn't show him any of the essays about his illness for reasons like anyway, I didn't feel like I wanted him to read my experience of his illness.
Yes.
Even though he would have read them eventually in the book if he had survived. But he did read The Other Side when it was published in a journal. And I was really anxious because I felt like I portrayed him as like chauvinistic. And then he was just like, this is beautiful, it's amazing. And I was like, what about the part where I quote him saying, like, of all the neighbors.
Of all the peoples you could have as neighbors, the Greeks got stuck with the Turks. I laughed out loud to that. This is really funny though.
I'm glad you're not offended. No, and then I was worried he would be offended that I portrayed him as racist, because then he says they're animals. Like, matter of factly.
Right, but for him though, like, that's the way it is, sort of. Like,
yeah, he didn't see that as racist at all. He's like, just read it like, yeah, you correctly quoted me. He just really believes they're animals.
he was like, well, thank you. You did a good job of quoting me correctly, Joanna. Actually, Joanna, speaking of these narratives, because I laughed at what your father said about, how the Greeks got stuck with the Turks. Like, of all the peoples you could be stuck with, you have the Turks.
The Japanese, we could have the
But
Argentinians.
we have these narratives here too, and that's why it was very interesting to read your perspective on it, and sort of read these renditions, like Greek renditions of these narratives. One interesting thing, my mom, once she told me that she decided to wear the hijab, and she started to wear the hijab when she was after she got married around 23, I think, when she was at my grandparents' summer house. We were all there vacationing, and then she had a nightmare where she was being raped by Greek soldiers.
Wow.
And then she decided to wear the hijab. Like, this gives me goosebumps, because
Yes.
these are the stories that she had been told.
Of
I
course.
have been told, right? The Greek soldiers are here and didn't it happen? I'm sure it happened on both sides. I'm
Of
sure.
course. Like when I said, we have those narratives from during the retreat of the Greek, like we
Yeah.
present the Greeks invaded Asia Minor. It took a long time for me to actually realize that, because I learned that history as we were just going to get back what was ours, from 400 years ago. It's like, we're taking it now.
Right. It's very natural, though. That's what you've been taught,
Yeah. But then I was like, wait a minute, what do you think those soldiers did on their retreat? Were they like, and I had to think by myself, wait a minute, there's no way those Greek soldiers retreating through Turkey to the coast didn't rape any Turkish women. And like, I've actually never been told that by anybody. I had to come to that conclusion by myself. And so you're the first person that has told me this, even in implication, because all of the literature I've ever read always presents the other side as the rapist, just like Americans think of the Mexicans.
But it's also very interesting that for someone like my mom, for instance, right? I don't know what happened that day. Maybe she read something about the Greco-Turkish War, or maybe they took a walk by the sea. Maybe she just remembered some of the history lessons or the narratives. It's so fascinating to me that that's what she remembers. Like, that was the nightmare: Greek soldiers raping her. This is a trauma. It's
Right, definitely a cultural trauma. It's
absolutely
most likely you're saying that it didn't happen to her personally, but
right.
it's imagination. And that's a similar, like, people don't understand how, like, I was affected by the invasion in this sense of, like, even the word invasion, in the sense of, like, somebody will come into your private space. And I think that's why rape is so prevalent. And why men imagine themselves, I feel like, and as I mentioned in the example of why the women who jumped off the cliff
Right.
of Suli are glorified, even men imagine their own violation through the idea of their woman being raped.
It's fascinating to me.
Like a male anxiety, and the way we were told that we are, and girls are still being told that we glorify the women of Suli because they chose suicide rather than being dishonored. And it's like not the trauma of the rape, not the pain of the rape, but this idea of dishonor and humiliation. I think, and I haven't found many people that agree with me, but the way I receive this glorification of their suicide is that they maintained the honor of the men who imagine their shame through the rape of their women. I don't know, do you feel that too with your mom's sort of story and how she internalized her own violation as this sort of larger cultural shame, which then requires, it's like the remedy of the cultural embarrassment, humiliation, penetration is for the woman to wear a hijab.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I actually never talked to my mom about what exactly it was that made her wear the hijab. I think that would be fascinating. But your explanation makes sense to me. Absolutely. So why, right? Why? Okay,
Yeah.
you may have had this nightmare, but why did that lead you to wear the hijab? And you're also right in that, the story that the narrative that you mentioned in your book about women jumping off the cliff, it's better to die than dishonoring the men. By extension, dishonoring the nation. So in a way,
Yes. Yeah.
crying for the nation. So that's why we have this idealization and glorification of their death. You talk about this desire for manual labor, this desire for the earth, and I was fascinated by it. So, let's see here. In one of the essays, you say, even after my father took his whole family back to America because he had been, by the earth's promises, disappointed, the earth on which he was born kept on calling. And I felt it too, desire for that earth. Can you talk a little bit about this pull towards the earth?
It's hard to say much more, even though I usually have so much to say, because it's so primal. And I was actually quite surprised to discover that other people don't feel this way. Like, I really liked Touch the Ground, and oh my God, now I'm getting flooded with images of Cyprus. And like, I just feel like the ground there and the rocks and the mountains and the earth are like connected to me. And I didn't feel that even though I started in the US, which is the difference between us. Like, and I used to make my little mud pies and I played in the dirt a lot in the US. Then there was some kind of pull in the landscape and the dry landscape, which I really liked in Lesbos, which I wasn't expecting, but I thought that was attractive. I liked that landscape. And then even in New Mexico in the US, I also found that this felt like this landscape spoke to me somehow. And there's just something primal and satisfying about the Cypriot, Greek Cypriot earth and this. And I don't know whether it is somehow in the, I call it inherited recesses of my imagination.
Mhm.
You know, they're finding so much about what's encoded in our DNA and like traumas in our DNA. What if the landscape, what if the molecules of Cypriot Greek earth really do have some kind of resonance with what I've inherited, or is it because of how I grew up being told that the earth is holy, that that is where I'm from? I'll never know where it really comes from, but it is quite real. And actually, last night I dug a ditch because it rained a lot here in Virginia, and I actually got a lot of satisfaction from that. Like, struggling with the earth is very satisfying for me.
I love that. And the Cypriot landscape becomes so vivid in
I'm
the
so glad.
absolutely with the smells, the smell of oregano, thyme, and with the fruits, for instance, and at your dad's funeral too, you make these special dishes. Um, it was it was emotional, Joanna. And the end, I may have shed a tear or two. The end was sublime. So that leads me to another question. Do you think that this connection to Earth, you have inherited that from your father? Because he talked to you a lot about, the moon and the Earth, and he had his own garden. So do you think maybe that's the case?
It's definitely the case, and people have criticized a little bit and asked, why so much emphasis on the father. Some people think that it's because he passed away, earlier, but most of the essays about my father were written 4 or 5 years before he died. So that's not it. And I was criticized for perpetuating the patriarchy by effacing the mother. So I was forced to ask myself, why is that? And I realized that my feelings and thinking aligned with my father for many reasons, some of them to do actually with patriarchy, and the fact that my father was the one who felt the power and entitlement to kind of define the family agenda, define the family desire. And so when I was asked to reflect on why I aligned myself with my father, I was like, well, doesn't it make sense that I would align myself with the point of view that had power in the family on the one hand, but I think also there's some kind of disposition there. There's also possibly an Oedipal complex, who knows, going on, because we're very textbook. I was aligned with my father, my brother was aligned with my mother in the family, like so many families with one son and one daughter growing up together. So yes, I feel that he gave that to me, it's a gift and a curse, but I feel like through reflection and through writing and a lot of conversations, I may have managed to escape the curse that he suffered.
Joanna, as a reader, can I make a quick analysis?
Yeah.
And this is, it's because
No,
it's
I
because,
love that. It's funny the when I read at Brown and any other like literature scholar, they like writers ask about process, and then scholars like they do a wonderful analysis, and then they ask any comment, and I'm like, that's a really good analysis, because sometimes after that I don't have anything to add.
Me too. This is coming um, from a personal place for me, because your relationship with your mother and your father, it has resonated with me, because I have a somewhat a constrained relationship with my mom, in the sense that I don't feel like she accepts me as I am, and I do want to talk more about that, because the moment when you come out to her is very powerful, and it made me cry actually, and the end of that essay. But based on your narration of your experiences with your father, I could see that your father believed in you. Your father believed in you. Maybe that was, how you really experienced your relationship with him. So it the way that I read it was that he was there for you, and he believed in you. And I don't know if that's true, but it seemed like he was closer to you than to your siblings. So it made perfect sense to me that you focused on your relationship with your father rather than your mother. And I think your relationship with your mother comes out as quite important too. And, it really guides you in the right direction as you make sense of who you are, I think, and as you evolve. So, can you talk a little bit about writing about your relationship with your mother? Was it a difficult process? Reading about it was difficult.
Both were difficult, but in different ways. Like many of the sentences about my father came out with pain, but also like I wanted to be writing that, and it felt really natural. And when people asked me why I wasn't writing about my mother, I just thought it was really strange. Like, why would I? It sounded like an odd proposition, because I didn't feel in any way drawn to do so. And I think actually both of that, there's very few essays in the book that involve her. The one that's early in the book that happened when I was in middle school with the snow in Cyprus.
In Cyprus.
She doesn't look very good in it as well, but I was actually at a coffee shop and I told my friend the story, and she's like, you have to write that. And I was like, you know what? I'm never going to write it if I go home. So I just sat down and wrote it. And that's why it's in the present tense and everything else is in the past tense. But I just wrote it down because my friend told me to, and it stayed there. And, if you analyze it, it's a little, it could be Freudian as well, because like all I remember from that moment is that I'm wearing my mother's skirt and there are pins in it.
Right. I know. I got that. I think it was perfect. The symbolism was perfect.
I mean, but that's what happened. She made us walk to church and there were pins in the skirt that she gave me.
In the snow.
Snow, when everybody knows that when it snows, you stay home. So there's that, and that my friend told me to write because I just told her as a funny story. I had no intention of writing it. And then when she told me about my grandfather and his brother, and this like secret that wasn't a secret, I started writing that without goodbyes. And then I think I started writing it. And then at the end of the summer, I came out to her. So it was like, I wrote that essay kind of while it was happening, knowing that the book needed it, because I had asked our friend Jen, the fiction writer, to read it. And she actually told me, for this book to work, you need to come out to your mother. And I was horrified at the idea. And then I was like, no, what I'm going to do is challenge the typical coming out narrative by raising the expectations and then subverting them by leaving that question unresolved, and Jen wasn't like, no, you can't do that. But that was just her suggestion from a narrative point of view, which is a whole other interesting question in nonfiction. Do you make this fairly major life decision because it totally changes the power dynamic in a way? Like my relationship with my mother was tense before I came out to her, but I had the power because she knew there was something I wasn't telling her, but not her not knowing meant that she didn't have power, and I had the power of control of that information. And I knew that once I gave her the information, I would also give her the power to use it however she wanted to. So we'll never know whether I was influenced by that comment from Jen when she kind of gave me that opening, and I was like, well, I guess this is it. Let me do it. But yeah, they were much more uncomfortable, and I wrote them more for kind of reasons like I was told to for in all the instances that I've written about my mother, and I've never done so spontaneously. Like the unsent letter to my father, which has gotten a lot of sort of emotional comments. It just happened exactly the way I wrote it, where he gave me this comment. He told me that I needed to get married, and then I just went into my bedroom and started writing a letter to him while he was in the other room.
Was that before he got sick?
No, he was sick. He was sick from 1994 or 1990. My dad got heart disease and my mom got cancer back-to-back years, like 94 and 95, when I was 15 and 16. So it was a really long time, which is why his death was not unanticipated and not traumatic. And actually, I wonder if this kind of simmered in your brain at all. I start the book with his funeral for many, many reasons. One, Yulia asked me to describe the funeral, and then once I had that description, I was like, oh, this belongs in the beginning of the book. But I wanted to draw the contrast actually between a loss that is given meaning by the community, that is anticipated and appropriately mourned, and actually the trauma that is caused by homophobia. And it might sound disrespectful to compare those two, but I am going to, ask the reader to reflect on the two kinds of pain. And I want readers to see when the community receives your pain, it is processed and it works, it becomes part of us because it's mirrored back to us by the community. And I did not suffer trauma but from that, but I did suffer trauma because of this refusal of the community to see my experience of desire, of sexual desire, to listen to the pain. I was told, oh, like it's 2000, whatever, it can't possibly be that bad. So that contrast, we started talking about my father, and I'm like, yeah, and I'm able to mourn him, and I want to show how mourning is really, really a gift of the culture.
Right. So on one side, there is this type of pain that you can express, right, freely, and on other, there is this pain that, depending on where you are standing, actually, in what culture you're in, right, you're either not allowed to express or you're making a big deal out of it.
Yes, that was so well captured. And you are one of the few people who could understand that because your culture is so much more similar to mine.
Yes, it's difficult, absolutely. I think it definitely comes through in the book. And Joanna, I'll let you go in a bit. I'm sorry. I feel like I haven't even gotten to my questions, but there's one thing that I really want you to, tap into at least, and it ties into mourning, this act of mourning. So there is this, you have this desire, as the narrator, you have this desire to understand the world and yourself and your parents through literature with me. But I am fascinated by the scene at the beginning when you are, mourning the passing of your father, and both you and your mom are reading. She's reading the Bible and you're reading theory, of course. And I read that and I said, yes, of course, that's exactly what I would do. And you're reading his journals and you're actually typing and retyping his journals, and you're also doing this work of translating, and I was fascinated by it. Do you think that aided you in the process of mourning, and in what way, if you can talk about that a little bit?
I think that his loss, his disappearance became, I think, less shocking and uncanny. For a lot of people, I think the going from having the person right there to them just not being there is what's shocking. It's like, I feel like I'm just going to repeat the same thing again, where it's really strange to inhabit a world that doesn't have your father in it.
Yes.
And so not only preserving my father, but it wasn't a preservation. That was such a great question, because I haven't articulated it fully yet. Getting to take his voice and things I didn't know about him, and I actually got to read them a little bit with my sister, which is how I knew that she couldn't quite read his handwriting. And so I got to feel like I had this privileged connection with him because I was able to decode his handwriting, and also because I felt like I imagined that he purposely left them for me, knowing that I would be interested, and that so he continued to speak to me, he continued to give me new information about himself, a little bit information, in the sense he's very, it's actually quite cute how he talks about girls. He just names, like, I saw such and such a girl, and we like exchanged glances. I wish that young men, and he'll say, the neighbor is going to drive me nuts. She keeps like glancing at me. And then on some days he just says, I didn't see anything. And the only way to figure that out is on the other days, he names a girl that he saw. So like he got to look like, but he was so satisfied by just looking at girls. And it's so adorable. And that's like an intimate but very innocent disclosure from my father after he passed away. So I got to communicate with him. I guess that's the key.
Mm-hmm.
I was able through the journals and through typing. And so I sort of spoke his words for him into the world after he passed away. And so that transition from him being right there and not being there was much more gradual for me and much easier to understand. And what we call processing nowadays is just getting my mind and my body to just wrap my mind around the idea that I now live in a world where my father can't speak, but he kind of can through me. I guess that's what I was also maybe empowering myself and giving my, through the very simple task of transcribing and translating, I was also maybe giving myself permission or acquiring permission to speak for him.
I love that, Joanna. And I think one of the things that makes your memoir powerful is that you were communicating with your father as you were rewriting the new Joanna, right?
Yeah.
The new Joanna into existence. And it comes through. It definitely comes through in the book. And as I was talking to my friends, I always said, well, as I was reading the book, I felt like I was having coffee with Joanna. And yeah, part of it is that I know her, but the other part is that you can feel the emotions. And maybe because our culture is similar, our experiences are very different, but somehow similar too in some ways, that I could feel the narrator. Let me put it that way. So it was such a powerful read for me. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you for being such an amazing reader. I think a lot of people see it as, a kind of a foreign, like they feel like it's more of a travelogue and introducing them to a new culture. I think a lot of American readers will be excited to learn a lot of new information, and that's the excitement for them. But it's really wonderful to get to talk to somebody who feels the experiences in such an intimate way, because it's just another point of view. It's the other side of a culture that is yours as well.
As I said, I feel like I have so many more questions for you, but I don't want to keep you.
Okay, and that's in 2 hours.
For your morning, really, you just allocated your morning.
It was fantastic.
I loved it. Do it more often.
I would love that. It really, I feel like I can really get more